If I wanted to give my future grandchildren or great-grandchildren $100, I just want to give them the money. Well, one, if I actually just held the $100 bill or 5 20s under my pillow and 50, they'd be like, what are you, a moron? Because like today it buys them 20 gallons of gas or 30 gallons of gas, but then it would buy them what, one? They'd be like, you're just so stupid. But and if I buy them stock, well, now again, I might pick the wrong one. And same thing with real estate or anything else. I just want to give them this money. And the only thing you could do that with is Bitcoin.
Hello and welcome to Bitcoin with Jake. This is a podcast all about people's personal journeys to Bitcoin. I wanted to know more about the people converging on this new form of money. Why do they see value in it? What skills enable their understanding? How is it changing their lives? If you're a founder looking for funding or an investor looking to make investments, then please reach out as I develop my network in the space. Do me a favor and chuck us a 5-star rating on whichever app you're using to listen, or a like if you're watching it somewhere. As insignificant as this may seem, they help a startup project like this hugely. Lastly, if you have any questions at all, please just reach out. The easiest place to find me is on Twitter at Jake ES Woodhouse. Now, I'd like to take a quick moment to talk about our sponsor. Fastbitcoins are a Bitcoin exchange who you should definitely take a look at next time you're thinking of making a Bitcoin purchase. They're a great team, which for me is always the key to due diligence, whilst their product has a ton of features useful to every Bitcoiner. Check out my episodes with Danny Brewster, the founder CEO, and Nathan Smith, the chief compliance officer, to learn more about the people behind the brand. Thank you to Fastbitcoins for sponsoring the show. Now, on to today's episode. I'm pleased to have Cedric Youngelman on the show. Hey, Cedric, how are you?
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
No, my absolute pleasure. It's great to always get people on who are podcast hosts themselves. The conversation is often very rich and I learn a lot myself. So I'm excited for today's conversation. To start things off, please, where and when did you hear about Bitcoin?
Sure. So, you never know the first time you heard about it because you don't remember forgetting about it per se. I thought I probably came across it once or twice before I really started to pay attention. When I started to pay attention was in 2017. I had come over to Twitter in 2016 or 2017. I'd gotten off Facebook and I was probably on FinTwit and probably political Twitter, and Bitcoiners just kept coming into my feed with what seemed like really obnoxious truths and absolutisms and irrefutable evidence of a world-changing technology. And combine that with price running in 2017. So that piqued my interest. And I had never been one to really speculate or gamble on something. But, for some reason, I also have kind of the attitude of if you're going to speak in those terms, I'm going to try to refute. So I would try to scratch that itch and refute some of these arguments or a toxicity or whatever I was coming across. And I couldn't refute these arguments. Not out of hand, not very quickly. And even if I put in a lot of work, I was finding that I was coming up against a wall. So combine that with how grand these statements were. And then that toxicity becomes appealing, or whatever you want to call it, the arrogance or the absolutism, or, because you're finding truths and you're scratching away at the surface. So that's kind of the beginning. I just started looking at Bitcoin and really kind of got fascinated by it, mostly because I think probably price, like anyone else comes to the table. I mean, to go further, if you want.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So I'm looking at this thing, I'm thinking about it. I think I'm facing issues, as a father, that everyone's facing with inflation and the old, adage, I'm going to try to make some money with some money, and I found out about Coinbase. That was the most reputable place I could think to buy this thing. And, now you have to go through the legacy banking system to get your money into Coinbase. So it took like 4 or 5 business days to get the ACH over. And all of a sudden price is just moving at, a tremendous amount per day. So I sent over enough to buy what I thought was going to be one whole Bitcoin. And now I don't have enough money to buy one whole Bitcoin, maybe like half a Bitcoin, or a third of a Bitcoin. So at that point, you're looking at this thing and unit price buy, kicks in. You're okay, I want to buy this thing, but I can't buy a whole one. What does it mean to buy a half or 3/4? So I thought, okay, why don't I buy a little bit of this? And I could buy, these other things that they're showing me. And I just discovered cryptography and blockchain and everything else. So maybe these other things have value and I can buy multiples of them that I can't buy Bitcoin of, ETH and Litecoin. And so I bought 5 of one, 10 of the other. And those things actually did better over the final 6 or 7 weeks of 2017. So now, I think I'm a genius and I've discovered the world's new technology, and I'm reading ICOs and white papers, and especially, as price crashed, you got to figure out what you have on your hands at that point. Is this what you thought it could be? Is this something that you want to hold forever or a long time? Is this something that you need to sell now and get out of? What's the difference between all these things? And that sort of led my journey to becoming a Bitcoin maxi, doing the research to figure out how Bitcoin was different from the other things that I was looking at.
Awesome. It's that whole phrase, isn't it, of having skin in the game. You have skin in the game, you start paying more attention to something, and through that process, you learn a whole heap of stuff that you had no idea was under the surface. And that happens to lots of people. And I love hearing about what that process was like. You mentioned something about, basically people on Twitter talking in absolutist terms and trying to refute some of the statements they were making. If you could think back to that time, what were some of the points that these people were making that really caught your attention? And if you could highlight one that kind of really irritated you and you just, I've got to reply to that prick, or like something else that just really resonated straight away, perhaps.
I can't think of anything specific. What I do remember is Pierre Richard talking about running the numbers. And as someone with an accounting and finance background, that was really appealing to me. So I'm learning about immutability, I'm learning about cryptography, but I can run the numbers on this technology, on the network. And what I started to learn about there, and the things that really sunk in, were concepts about money as a ruler, and money as technology, money as a ledger. So this led to some confusion at first, because I thought, triple ledger accounting, we were going to solve all intercompany problems in all aspects of industry, and that's why we needed shitcoins. But getting through that, finding out that Bitcoin is a ledger, an immutable ledger, but that I can run numbers on. There's only going to be 21 million of this. I can calculate. I can use it as a unit of account. I remember distinctly listening to Bitcoin Tina was really influential. And Bitcoin Tina was talking about how things like a ladder emerge organically and from the ground up. You're not told what the shape of a ladder should be. Everyone just kind of agrees on what is the best way to climb a wall, or whether it's a hammer or a chair. And so I started learning about emergent technology, and you're kind of learning about all these different disciplines. And when you start intertwining them, the synergy gets really powerful. But I really started thinking about money as a ruler and how we count things. And I started thinking about, if you pay taxes on your house and it's based on your square footage. So every year the government sends you a ruler and they're like, okay, how many square feet in your house? And you're like, this year there's 1,000 square foot. And like, okay, you owe us $1 for a square foot, $1,000. And next year they send you the ruler, and the ruler's smaller. And now you're like, okay, I have 1,100 square feet. I owe you more. And so this whole concept of how to count things and count things correctly. And with a lot of things in life, like you could take health statistics or political statistics, and you could try to count things and look at things from different angles. But you get into issues of uniformity. Are we counting the same thing? Are we looking at it the same way? How do we count something? With Bitcoin, we kind of avoid all that, and we kind of find these truths, which really helped me then distill a lot of arguments outside of Bitcoin and have more faith in those arguments, because you could run the numbers.
It's so compelling, isn't it? There's lots of different touch points that pop up and things start to make sense. And, for anyone that hasn't dived into the Austrian economics rabbit hole, I mean, suddenly economics starts to make sense, at least in my opinion, and my experience with it, having studied economics in the past and always been a bit like, whatever, move on,
right?
Because it wasn't compelling, it wasn't engaging, it didn't make much sense. And then suddenly it's all about individual humans and how they think and behave. Well, that actually makes a lot more sense. Yeah, how cool. Okay, so you mentioned you have an accounting and finance background, Cedric. So what does that kind of background teach you? And how do you think that helped you understand Bitcoin?
Well, it doesn't teach you Austrian economics.
Yeah.
So that was maybe something that really stuck out early on as something that was kind of irritating and I couldn't refute. It was a way of looking at the world through Austrian economics. I had degrees in finance and accounting. I'd studied economics. I took my studies seriously. I enjoyed them. I enjoyed the discussions, and this whole sector or angle or way of thinking about economics wasn't presented to me. So I had to learn about it before I could refute it. I had to learn about praxeology before I could think about, and by the time I learned about these things, I wasn't desiring to refute them per se, but that required work on my end to understand the argument, to straw man the argument, to understand the other person's point of view. And my way of thinking is if I'm going to debate somebody, I want to know their side better than they do. So I had to learn these things. And that was the challenge. So the challenge was really kind of was bothering me was if I didn't know something, then what was I going to do about it? Was I just going to ignore it and just write it off? I'm going to figure it out, especially though when you tie it to there could be a great increase in purchasing power by holding this asset. And I saw in other ways in my life, this was before I owned the book When Money Dies. I haven't made my way entirely through it, but I get a lot of the concepts and I'm watching all around me money die and the monetization of everything. So if I wasn't thinking about like the mix in my 401k, like, isn't it enough that I go to work all day and I come home and I want to spend time with my family? But no, it's not even just what's in your 401k. You got to administrate it, like sign up for it, register, talk to somebody. I mean, all of this work outside of your work just to maintain your wealth. And I started thinking deeply about cash and savings technology, which is what Bitcoin is, and all those things. And so when come for the gains, you stay for the money, but the defensive technology of it, the defensive nature of it, the way I could separate my money from state, the debasement of money, or just the access to the money, or being able to, the concept of being able to transact with anyone you want to. All those things didn't necessarily have monetization value to me, but I mean, one thing I noticed even just in my own life, I was collecting things and I ended up reselling some of them for more money. And there were items I could find in my area of the country that were valuable. And that was one of the first things, in the bear market, I was selling some of those things because I was like, okay, fine. I won't use, cash income, but I have this toy or I have this collectible. I'll sell that for Bitcoin. I'd rather store my value in that. But thinking a lot about what my peers were doing too, whether it was going on Robinhood or to buy stocks or, they got expensive whiskeys, thinking about those kinds of things, or just looking at buying rental properties. What everyone was trying to do to survive was, all those sort of dilemmas was things that was pushing me towards Bitcoin. It was obviously the best solution to a lot of those problems.
It's so cool when you kind of have that light bulb moment. So what you're describing could be summarized as wealth protection problem. We need to try and keep what's ours, but we don't know how to. And so we have to figure out ways of doing that because the money's broken. And so you either buy some fine wine and hold it forever, or you buy a car that's a particular, model number and therefore quite scarce, or you get into buying, I don't know, it could be fucking anything, right, that you think is going to keep value over time. But you have to go to work. So you're up at 6 o'clock in the morning, 7 o'clock. You've mentioned you're a father, so you have kids to look after, get them out the house, get yourself to an office of some form or whatever your day job might be, earn your income, get home, and then still figure out all this stuff. And so what really strikes me as incredibly powerful about this story that is Bitcoin is the problem you just highlighted is felt by absolutely everyone, regardless of their class or income bracket per se. And that's what makes it for me so exciting as a savings technology. So could you explain a little further for anyone out there that hasn't necessarily thought through what this problem is? Like, how many people feel the problem you just felt? And why is it that Bitcoin is so compelling to you to solve that problem?
I think everyone's feeling it whether they realize it or not. I think it goes back to, you want to send your kids to summer camp. You sent them to summer camp last summer. It's in the budget. And all of a sudden, you got a 2% raise at work and, summer camp went up 6%. And healthcare went up 8%. Wow. Right. So all these things, maybe you don't have a lot of money. Maybe you got an extra $50 or $100 a week. But, you're thinking, okay, I can't, what am I going to do? That's not going to make up the difference to get to summer camp, and that's not going to make up for the price. A lot of lifestyle creep. A lot of people, whether it's a cup of Starbucks a day or whatever, and you want to keep it. I'm not debating whether you should have these things or not, but like whatever it is that you're doing, you're like, I want to keep that. I want the kids to go to summer camp this summer. But again, you got this inflation problem just everywhere. So you got this extra $50 a week. You could go consume it and just ignore the problem. That some people do that. You can go to Robinhood and try to throw it at Shopify and a bunch of other bullshit. You can try to sit on it in cash until you can afford $3,000 to put it in a mutual fund and be in S&P, which is the Standard and Poor. So you can be Standard and Poor like everyone else. What do you do? So that's why people go to Robinhood, and because you could buy slices of stocks and you don't have to save up and you can gamble there or whatever. And it just leads to, like, I think a lot of nihilism or all these defensive practices. I was recently at a baseball card show.
Wow.
And it was a very fascinating site because you literally have people trading their paper money as customers with pictures of Jefferson and Washington and for Mickey Mantle and Henry Allen for better paper money. When you run into all the same problems with regular money, can you validate this baseball card? And it was just fascinating. Do you have liquidity in the market? Can you store it? Are you going to protect them from fire and water? The business in the show, and all they're doing is trading paper. And they're all looking for scarcity. There was tremendous inventory in this place. This was a small show. And I was asking, all the dealers there, the professional dealers, they're all connected to the manufacturers. Mm-hmm. And they get the sets before they hit the stores. Mm-hmm. And they show up there with the unopened boxes. It's all pre-mined, right? Yeah. And, so they're flipping it. You come in, you have a card, you're going to get 20, 30% on the dollar. You're not going to get full price. And, so it's a whole thing. It's a whole racket on a racket.
Wow.
But they're looking for a place to store some value and to get lucky, to find, that Wayne Gretzky rookie card or that Michael Jordan rookie card. I went over to a table. There were 3 Mickey Mantles. One was 60,000. One was all the same card. One was 60,000, one was 40,000, one was 20,000. Someone turned to me and said, one of them has to be a fake. And not just based on price, but 2 didn't look like the other. One didn't look like the other. So, you get into all these issues, but this is literally when money dies. Mm. And I know baseball cards been around for a while, but they have a huge resurgence since March of 2020. Mm. Just like a lot of other markets where there's any perceived scarcity. But in baseball cards, it's really weird. In baseball, I'm all sporting cards because you have player risk. You try to get a young guy before he's famous and worth a lot, but he could get hurt. He could trade to the wrong team. You got team risk, you got scandal risk, all these things, liquidity issues, fraud. Yeah. The companies have more stock than they're saying. So that there's actually been all these new developments of like these one of a kind cards.
Mm. More artificial scarcity arrives.
Right.
Wow. What's really fun about explaining that is until you see it, you don't see it. So, you have your own podcast, the Bitcoin Matrix podcast. It's awesome. I've listened to a bunch of shows and thank you for all the work you do there. You would have been at that event. I can just imagine this is the first time we've ever spoken, obviously, but you're looking at it through this Bitcoin lens and all this stuff that's going on around you. And you're like, they don't understand really what's happening here, do they? And it's like a bunch of kind of headless chicken running around trying to chase a pot of gold. Actually, the gold isn't gold, it's gold plated, and actually there is another pot of gold quite nearby, and actually there's shitload. Do you know what I mean? It's just the whole thing falls to pieces when you see it like that. Wow. And that actually leads nicely to a question I love asking, which is, since you've found out about Bitcoin, you've asked these questions that you wanted to say, you guys are wrong, but actually you found yourself siding with them more and more over time. How has Bitcoin changed you over the last kind of 4 or 5 years since 2017?
Tremendously. It's hard for me to separate how much I would have gone through certain changes without Bitcoin, but I attribute so much of it to Bitcoin. I think it's calmed me down. It's relieved a lot of stress and anxiety over certain issues. Mm-hmm. I think it's empowering. I think all of this comes from lowering my time preference and thinking more long term. So I think that just makes me a better father and husband. I always try to, I got a lot of work in all those areas, as everyone probably does, but I think it's helped me along that journey. I think it's given me a lot of confidence in the questions I had in the world to keep asking them. I've always been raised to ask questions. Mm-hmm. But I think when, I hit a certain age, I gave up on finding answers that would help me change the world. The industrial military complex, that's not good. What am I going to do about it? Mm. I got to go to work tomorrow, go to my fiat job. This is 2004. Right? What am I going to do? Start buying gold? But with Bitcoin, I really started to understand the concept of voting with your feet. Mm-hmm. And it didn't make me less interested in the political nature of human beings, but less interested in actual maybe politics of popularity contests and more national politics that are so far from my local life. Mm-hmm. But it made me focus even more. And I think I've always thought about this, but just going to where you could find good fertile land instead of trying to get everyone to take 7 years off from farming and do it the right way, and or, not take shortcuts, whatever it might be. Gave me more faith in that, and more faith in revisiting a lot of questions I had from earlier.
And so that makes me curious. So you just mentioned 2004 and the military industrial complex and thinking that's no good, but what am I to do about it? Can you teach me about some of the questions that you did have that you'd kind of put to the side? Okay, there's nothing I can do about that have risen their head again, and now you feel intrigued to follow them more.
Sure. I'd say education. So how education is chosen, how curriculum is chosen, perspective, history. It reinvigorated my appetite for revisiting history and spending more time on it and questioning perspectives. Yeah, I think like from point of view, but what else? It kind of helped me through the pandemic recently. So that was more of a forward-looking thing. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, mostly around narratives, I think, and propaganda and education, morality, things like that.
So that's an interesting thing to bring up. So morality. What was your question that you had in relation to morality from 20 years ago now? What was the question you were asking, and why did that come up in your life, and how is that now more approachable as a subject?
So I think it's more along the lines of not so much I was questioning my own morality, but how can I prove morality? How can I prove that there's a spectrum that exists and there's either less or more moral? And I think in the world, you don't have a truth board. A ball is sometimes the most, you hear the expression, ball don't lie.
Mm-hmm.
It's a round ball. If you got a perfectly round, asphalt, like the ball is going to bounce true. And so very few things in life were bouncing true, but there was no way to disprove it. And most people were going with the flow. I'm kind of maybe a contrarian by nature, so I don't just go against the crowd or against the grain, but I definitely, when I see the crowd going one direction, I always look the other way. What is going on here? And maybe it's not good to go with the crowd. Doesn't mean I won't end up going with the crowd if I confirm, hey, I think they're all going in the right direction. That makes sense. But I'm going to kind of glance around and do a 360 and try to make my own call, avoid groupthink.
Mm-hmm.
So I think with something like Bitcoin, there were a lot of things that, like even just economics or politics that, you get into discussions with people. And I think with something, with sort of the advent or invention of Bitcoin, it's kind of like I've gained a lot of conviction to say, I don't agree, and this is why. And where I can run the numbers, that's where I'll stick to.
So you can verify in a sense.
Yeah. So if I could verify something.
I love that design philosophy, don't trust but verify. It's completely absent in basically everything I've done my whole life, which is extraordinary when you really think about that. Like that whole concept of don't worry, trust me. Okay. And that's how you're conditioned to think. And then suddenly along comes this thing that goes, terrible idea. X, Y, Z reasons why it's a terrible idea. Just look at what's going on in this area of your life, and this area of your life, and this area of your life. How about a system where you can just look yourself? And so that's obviously something that really resonated with you. Is that, do you think, the accounting background playing into that process as well? So I imagine, you were looking at companies all day long, trying to analyze, were they healthy, were they unhealthy, where was their holes? Traditional accounting is also, you can massage numbers. So how does that play into things, now that Bitcoin exists?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, the foundation of my background is an audit. So it's really proving or disproving or, sustaining or a balance versus, and looking at how things are counted. So all of those things appealed to me when looking at Bitcoin. And I mean, it's one of the reasons I've chosen accounting as a profession, because you can validate and verify. A lot of times what an auditor is doing is proving or disproving a balance. So you say you have balance X, well, this third party says you have Y. And it's not validated, or it is. And we could discuss maybe how down the road. But the point is, it either works or it doesn't in that regard. So yeah, running the numbers just was very appealing to me.
And when I think of like the common understanding of an accountant, as someone who can look at a business and figure out what's going on, they're trustworthy, it's really important, trust your accountant. The world of Bitcoin represents something very different, and this whole idea of a triple entry ledger system. So can you teach me what the difference is between the traditional accounting model and what Bitcoin represents as a triple accounting model?
Well, okay, that's a great question. So a single ledger would be, I'm the king and you're a pawn, and you come to me and you sell me 10 cows. And I say, great, I owe you 10 bushels of wheat, and I got it here in the ledger. And you come back next week and you want to sell 2 more cows. Like, great, I owe you 2 bushels from last time. And you say, what? I thought you owed me 10. I said, no, my ledger says 2. Single ledger. So double ledger is you and I both have a ledger. So i.e. maybe, the bank, I see the ledger, you see the ledger. It's a centralized ledger, but we both can have access to it. And a triple ledger is in that regard, it's just a public ledger in that more than 2 parties have access to it. You could think of it that way. That's kind of how I think of it. I forget what maybe the original question was, but that's kind of how I think about it in terms of triple ledger.
For someone that doesn't understand accounting, I was looking to understand what accounting looks like and how different the traditional model of double entry bookkeeping is versus now the fact we have a triple entry ledger.
Sure. So in this example, more than 2 parties have access to the ledger, which is making it the triple ledger.
And so the point here being is that, Satoshi pulled together this incredible design, and part of it was a blockchain, which had previously never been of any use any other place. And that blockchain is the public facing record of data entry for all of the transactions that have ever happened. And that is a completely, brand new innovation that we can do commerce about, basically. Yeah, it's very, very cool when you start peeling away the layers as to like how different it is and what impact it might have. So Cedric, along this journey, you felt compelled to start a podcast. What did that, where did that come from? Why was that the case?
Sure. So diving down the rabbit hole, my zest to learn about and passion to learn about Bitcoin seems to be infinite. There was a lot of reasons I wanted to start the podcast. So COVID hit, and all of a sudden I lost my commuting time to work. Lost is not the right word because I don't miss it, but I wasn't commuting to work anymore. I wasn't stuck at the office with a lunch break. I wasn't sneaking away for an afternoon walk. So I lost a lot of time to listen to pods, and it was hard to reclaim that time during downs at home with different set of responsibilities and nowhere to go to kind of get that continued space to listen. And I really wanted to reclaim my Bitcoin research. Along the same lines, I'd always wanted to get into content creation, and podcasting was an art form I fell in love with since it came out, I guess. And I'd had a lot of feedback, maybe you should start a pod. And then fortunately and unfortunately, I got my wife to become a Bitcoiner, and she was listening to podcasts all day, and I would come home from work and she'd be listening to Peter McCormack's British accent all the time in the kitchen. So finally I was like, you know what? I should just throw my hat in the ring. Like, I was kind of running out of excuses. I just couldn't come up with reasons not to do it. I wanted to create a time capsule for my kids. So I felt like even if I didn't release these things, my kids could hear my questions and the ideas I was trying to chase down. I thought it'd be fun, and I couldn't come up with any other reason. So one night I had a few beers and I DM'd Pierre Richard, would he come on my show? And 8 a.m. the next morning, he was like, yeah, how about this week? And I figured I couldn't just do a podcast with one guest. So I started asking more people, and I started to put it together. Yeah.
And so I always ask for kind of a couple of audience questions. So shout out to Andy, who said, what was his favorite interview? And he says, why was it Saylor? So maybe he's heard you already say that Michael Saylor was your favorite interview, but I'll start with the first question. What's been your favorite interview so far?
Well, it's kind of like picking a child, your favorite child. I've enjoyed them all immensely. Yeah, I don't know if I had a favorite. They're all different, and they all have such different topics. And some of the ones that are maybe more fun to watch were like harder to be the host. And some of the ones, like maybe the ones that didn't come out the best, maybe was so much fun to be in the box. Yeah, maybe minute for minute, definitely Saylor. That's a great one. He just isn't. I think he just puts on also an incredible amount of ideas and memes and clarity, but he's incredibly articulate. And it's like watching Marlon Brando give the PowerPoint presentation. I mean, his ability to articulate and deliver and hit beats and set up his storylines and figure out how much time he has in the arcs and is just phenomenal. So it was kind of intense to sit there. And I only got to ask like 4 questions. But yeah, it was amazing. It was great.
So when did you start the pod, Cedric?
October. I started recording on September 28th, 2020.
Okay.
And then I released it
so
like 10 days later.
Just over 2 years you've been going now.
Yeah.
And is it something that you can see yourself doing for the next kind of 10 years? Or do you think?
Oh, totally.
Do you reckon?
I can see it doing it even after I retire. I mean,
yeah,
it's a lot of work. I don't want to gloss over that, but it's a lot of fun. And you get to have great conversations and meet interesting people. I wouldn't see why I would stop per se. I mean, I could see, I guess I could foresee lots of things that, would end the show, but I wouldn't. Yeah, it just seems like a lot of fun and I enjoy doing it.
What resonates for me when you talk through that is for one of the first times in my life, like I love asking people questions. I love hearing about what people do with their lives and find it incredibly inspiring, the challenges that they face, the challenges they overcome, and like what's not to like about great conversations. And therefore there is literally like multi-decade time horizons on this type of conversation, I think, because you never get bored of it, right? All these different people that you're very fortunate to come into contact with that are willing to share their time. And every conversation I have, I come away having learned something new, which, frankly, as much as I love reading books, and I do, it's very easy just to sit and watch YouTube or, find yourself in front of like fucking 10 episodes of Netflix garbage that 10 hours of your life goes by or whatever other stuff might come up. Yeah. So is there any kind of major plans for the pod over the next year or so, or just kind of continue to keep as you're going? And what do you think some of what would you say is the overarching biggest lesson you've got from it?
All right. Well, so there's a lot there I kind of want to address.
Oh, please go for it.
I still have a full-time, I call my full-time day career. So that takes up a lot of time and I balance the show around that, but it is a lot of fun. It's interesting. Yeah, I love having the conversations. I think that's one of the things that I really enjoy is the art of conversation. And you brought up books. One of the reasons I enjoy the show so much, though, is I get to get lost in a book or an article or another pod to prep for the show. I truly enjoy the research more than probably anything. And that gets to be like my time in a way. And so I wanted to figure out a career or an opportunity to build around doing the research I wanted to do, the learning I wanted to do. I thought that would just be awesome. And then I get to ask the questions I want to ask. It's funny, you bring up like, what's your favorite interview? It's like sometimes like I've read the book 3 or 4 times, so I know maybe most of the answers or something like that. So sometimes maybe where no matter what I've done, I don't know the answers to the questions. Maybe it's really exciting for me in that regard. And then early on, one of the things I also wanted to start the show or a project like this was to have 100% control of something. So I do all the scheduling. I mean, I do everything A to Z, but so I really enjoy that. But early on, I didn't know what it took to start a show, and it's incredibly easy. So I recommend people, it costs no money, and I recommend everyone start a show. And I think there's a lot of room for a lot of different voices. But very early on, I started working with a producer just because I didn't know that it was that easy. And it kind of took some stress off my mind. And I lost all sovereignty through that process. And we asked like sort of like what would stop the show. So there was a point very early on the show where I was like, I want my recordings. I want access to I want my own account. I want my own keys to the show. And I felt like, how can I have a show about Bitcoin if I don't even control the keys to the show? And I felt so adamantly about it that I felt like if I get the keys back and I can't even do it on my own, or if you won't give me the keys and I can't do it on my own because I couldn't get my music and all that stuff, I won't do it. I won't do it for someone else. And I won't do it with anyone else having the keys. That was really important to me early on. And that would be like a reason I was willing to shut down the show. I was like, I'm not going to do this in a non-Bitcoin, non-sovereign way. And that's another thing about Bitcoin is just, I didn't really know the word sovereignty, or like what a sovereign individual was, but I really do appreciate as a control freak. It's one of the reasons I like Bitcoin is like, no one can come between you and the asset or the bet, if you want to see it that way. No one could debase your bet. It's not like you're trying to get a bar on the corner of Fifth Avenue and Broadway and you can't get a liquor license, but this guy can. No one has an insider shot. There is no ICO. There's no pre-mine. Those were all aspects that really appealed to me. I didn't know those things were going to be important. And I grew up in a world of basically equities. I mean, I'm fairly young. Bonds aren't appealing. Minerals and metals weren't appealing. You can't even own them in any sort of volume. Like, greatest lesson I learned by doing the show? That's a good question. I'd have to take a minute to think about that. I'm not sure what
That's okay. There's no rush. I mean, plenty of what you said has resonated with me. I started my podcast. I did everything myself for the first 40 episodes or something, and I have consequently hired someone to help on the production side of things. And largely that's because of having 2 small kids at home, and I've basically automated myself out of the production process. But I still have all the passwords. I hold all the accounts. They're all in my name. And that does really resonate with me. Having control of something, it's really important. And actually what you were talking about in terms of having a liquor license or not and opening a bar, what Bitcoin has taught me to look at is to try and define, well, what is ownership? Like, how do you actually own things? And going back to the problem that we all face, which is the wealth protection problem, you might own some fine wine. You might own some fractions of shares on Robinhood. You might own all these different kind of supposed contracts. You might own some baseball cards. But do you actually own it? And what is ownership? So maybe let's explore that a bit. The idea of a sovereign individual, what does that mean to you? And this whole idea of redefining ownership through Bitcoin.
Well, I think in a lot of ways it means accountability and responsibility. So accountability for yourself and I think hopefully others, and responsibility for yourself and your actions both, and the consequences. So I really think a lot about, I try to teach my kids, like, good choices lead to good outcomes, bad choices lead to bad outcomes. But there's no guarantees that a bad choice won't lead to a good outcome, and vice versa. So you can gamble that way. But the more risk you take on, the more probably bad outcomes you might get if you're thinking you could do the bad choice to get to a good outcome. Whatever that might be, whether it's around morality or gambling or stealing or lying or whatever it is, or even just benign things. So I really try to think through that, accountability and responsibility. Yeah, I'm trying to think. And then around ownership, just in terms of like storing your own keys. So what does that mean to other things in your life, and taking responsibility for, yourself and others, even ownership of your thoughts and your actions and how you impact others. I think these were all things I thought about before, but I think Bitcoin really highlights those things and brings them to the surface, and is a great teaching vehicle for those things. And I think that, like, because there's no accountability and truth in money, that's degraded in our language and our culture, because money is a language and it's a way of communicating values and ideas. I see it very clearly now.
So I didn't understand what this meant when I first heard it, but money is the language of, or the communication of value, which is in itself a language. And just as a really random example, I'm in a rental property at the moment with my wife. It's a beautiful house, but frustratingly, we moved in just after the owners renovated, and there's been a bunch of teething problems with the property that have taken up a huge amount of our time and have interrupted us and as tenants. And so there's an argument that's brewed over like 6 months between us, the agents, and the landlord. And it's costing the landlord a load of money. It's costing us a load of time, and everyone's pissed off about the situation they're in. But at the end of the day, and all the emails and all the reasons, what it boils down to is a financial figure. We're trying to negotiate a rent reduction and, issues that have cost us time or interruption. And you just think, wow, I'd never really considered that before. But so much of conversation that happens every single day is a negotiation over some kind of money that translates value between two parties. And it's a fascinating concept, isn't it? It's really only revealing itself to me right now. Yeah, has it really affected the way you think? Like, have you got any other examples that come to mind of how you started thinking?
Yeah, I think, I think a lot about Breed Loves Writing, and I think it's Masters and Slaves, Time and Money. Yeah. Robert's great. And I think about he tells a story about the winemaker who makes a bottle of wine, and for $20, he sells a bottle of wine and he makes a nice living. But all of a sudden, inflation, costs go up, and he's got a choice. He or she can make the bottle of wine, they could water it down, sell it for $20. They could degrade the ingredients, sell it for $20, or they could raise the price. And if they raise the price, most customers are not going to discern between the wine that's not watered down and the $20 bottle that's still the price they want, that is watered down. So it creates an antagonistic relationship between the merchant and the consumer. The merchant's forced to degrade the product, and the consumer is forced now to buy, it's kind of lied to. And, you think about like shrinkflation, like a pint of ice cream is now 11 ounces at the supermarket. I notice that at restaurants a lot now, everything's getting smaller. Yeah, everything. They're serving French fries, and all this is antagonistic. And the consumer wants to give the merchant the money, and the merchant wants the consumer to be happy. It's supposed to be a beneficial deal. Like, oh, I love this glass of wine at the end of the week, or this art, or whatever you're consuming or purchasing. Everyone wants it to be a happy deal, but because of the money, it becomes antagonistic, and we're at odds. And that negotiation is kind of, I think it's tearing families apart, as it gets worse and worse, but it starts with tearing the consumer and the merchant apart. But then it's families, it leads to divorces, it leads to suicides. I'm hearing a lot of people struggling with money, and I'm hearing stories about suicide. It changes the way, you interact with the doctor. So if you think about that, it messes with your food, it messes with your medicine. I mean, Bitcoiners know this, but it's very insidious. Literally, you give someone a gift, you give them $100 in cash, and it's like you're giving them something that steals from them the moment they hold it. And same thing with a merchant. And the way I've been trying to get it across with people is like, if I wanted to give my future grandchildren or great grandchildren $100, I just want to give them the money. Well, one, if I actually just held the $100 bill or 520s under my pillow and 50, they'd be like, "What are you, a moron?" Because like today it buys them 20 gallons of gas or 30 gallons of gas, but then it would buy them one? They'd be like, "You're just so stupid." But and if I buy them stock, well, now again, I might pick the wrong one. And same thing with real estate or anything else. I just want to give them this money. And the only thing you could do that with is Bitcoin. That you could be like, "Oh, wow, it's not been debased and it's money." And think about that in the time that it brings back to your life. You get that 30% of the time that you're spending trying to make your money not go down in value and preserve it. You get it back, and all the other things, it just colors all our interactions in society, and just a basic tool like money. And we don't steal from each other when we're trying to make each other happy.
It's incredibly powerful, isn't it, when you start thinking about the importance of what's actually going on here. I must say that's what brought me to Bitcoin myself, was actually listening to Michael Saylor and his kind of October 2020 podcast appearances, and his rationale for purchasing $400 billion worth of Bitcoin without telling anyone. Publicly traded company, teams of lawyers, teams of accountants, and they've all approved it. And that, I'd owned some for 5 years by that stage, but I'd never really taken much attention to it versus the rest of what was my portfolio. And a bit more about myself. My father died when I was 20. So I inherited some money in my 20s. And for the last 10 years, I'd been trying to work out, like, how do you beat inflation? How do I make sure that the next generation gets this money? And so without realizing it, him talking about how do I make sure someone can run my company as best as possible 100 years from now, I'm buying Bitcoin, was exactly the kind of lens I was looking at investing with, which is very long-term, relatively low risk. All I want to do is just give my, I wasn't even married then, right? But like children, what's theirs essentially. And every family faces this problem of trying to work hard your whole life. What you gain from that process, your productivity output, you should be allowed just to pass it to your kids. And, obviously when you're in the Bitcoin rabbit hole, you start looking into libertarianism, and the concept of the state really becomes more prevalent. And then inheritance tax and all this kind of stuff becomes a really fascinating conversation. But yeah, that resonates with me a lot about the $100. Like, how do you get $100 to your grandkids? And it's a very reasonable question, and it's fucking hard without Bitcoin. Right? It's now how,
and without trying to improve it. I'm not trying to risk it. I'm not trying to gamble it. I'm not trying to make anything more, just nothing less.
And Cedric, so something you mentioned earlier that I didn't touch on at the time, but I'd like to circle back to, is that your wife's into Bitcoin. So all of us that spend all day long banging on about Bitcoin, we have better halves somewhere in the world.
Don't do it.
How did you get her into it, and what's the story there?
Well, I don't know. We have an amazing relationship. She's my best friend. It'd be hard for me to be best friends with someone who wasn't a Bitcoiner. So, I guess we had to get there. But, I don't know. I never give anyone relationship advice. I don't know their relationship or anything like that. I think it's a great thing to be on the same page. But, I don't think you want to burn anyone out or, badger anyone. That was another reason I started the podcast. Was she was the only one who was tolerating. She's a Bitcoiner. It doesn't mean she wants to talk about Bitcoin all day. Due to Bob talking about this, I mean, it's like a lot of people only listen to Bitcoin podcasts for about a year. That's what they need. Not everyone's going to listen to Bitcoin podcasts for 10 years. And I think it's also where economics and finance and money is in that relationship, and where you want to take that conversation in the relationship, and how much you already share or want to share those responsibilities. I'm not even giving any advice here. It doesn't mean just because your wife is a Bitcoiner, maybe she makes all the decisions about money and this is your thing, or vice versa, or whatever it is. Doesn't mean you share or don't share if they are or aren't. But my advice is not to, I don't know what my advice would be to anyone else, but I think it's great for me and us. But I could see where it gets tiresome. And I tend to have a one-track mind. And so, I'm very lucky that she puts up with me, whatever it is,
Funny enough, Cedric, I wasn't necessarily looking for advice or to advise anyone listening.
Right.
And it really highlights in some ways, like Bitcoin's given me this sense of purpose and direction and understanding of the world that means I have a lot more confidence in my own decisions. So I'm happy to tell people what I'm doing, but you don't need to do what I'm doing. And I'm not going to suggest that you do, but I'm comfortable in that space. And I feel like that's what you were trying to tell me in some ways by saying, don't necessarily do this yourself. So that surely is something that it's very empowering, isn't it? When you suddenly go, okay, well, I'm comfortable with what I'm doing. I'm comfortable where I'm at, and you're welcome to do whatever you feel like. That's fine. But here's what I'm up to. Yeah, very cool. Okay. Well, Cedric, listen, so we're not far off an hour. The future. So where are we heading? What is this Bitcoin thing? And what are some of the ramifications that you think might happen in the next, say, 12 months or so? And what gets you excited about 2023?
What gets me excited about 2023? Well, it's another year. Every year gets better. I think that I think it's going to get way more volatile than anyone expects. I think that's very good for Bitcoin. I think that things are going to go faster than people think. I just did a show with Luke Mikic about this. I think that exponential technology built on top of exponential technology is going to have incredible network effects. That being said, I mean, this is not about number go up so much as, separating money from state. I think about it like in terms of like the remnant. There's this period of time where the remnant is all rubbing against each other and they're trying to figure things out. No one's communicating per se. And like not everyone in that time of the remnant is going to make it to the next epoch. Like I said, not everyone who's making good choices will always have good outcomes. And not everyone's going to make it through this battle. And I think it's going to be a very turbulent, chaotic time. But I think Bitcoin is the arc. I think it's the pin, not the bubble. And I think it's important to be incredibly patient. We don't know how things will play out. I think we're going to be surprised. I think that's the bottom line. I'm surprised by how this has already been playing out. I thought we would have had a much bigger blow off top in this past cycle. But I think in the long run, this is an incredible opportunity. If you believe in this thing and you run the numbers and you understand the system, it's a great opportunity. It's a life-changing opportunity to go through this bear market. But yeah, I think this thing could lift off at any time. And I think it could decouple at any time. But,
I never expected to be able to buy at, 16, 17, 18,000 US dollars again. I thought that trade was long, long gone, which in some ways means that in the future, the price is likely to drop a hell of a lot from whatever all-time high it gets to. So there'll be other buying opportunities, and that's just about being patient. But then at the same time, it's about capitalizing on the opportunity that we have right now. When you say run the numbers, just as a final question, how do you think through Bitcoin from a value perspective? And when you run numbers, like what are the kind of high-level metrics you're looking at?
So anytime I mention a number, everyone, why are you so bearish? I think there's some
I'm more intrigued in how you think rather than necessarily what the answer is, if that makes sense.
Sure. What I've been really intrigued by lately is the multiplier effect. I think Dylan LeClaire has laid this out, but for every dollar that comes into Bitcoin, it goes up 2.5 times that. You don't just have the multiplier effect, but you have the Saylor effect. So it's one thing if 100 million people put 1% into Bitcoin of their net worth, that's nothing compared to 5 billionaires putting half their net worth into Bitcoin. And everyone goes through the hodler journey where you put, your 1% in and it either goes up to 10% or you learn more about it and you allocate more to it. So I think in that regard, with the multiplier effect, if you think about there's $900 trillion of value in the world, and most of that is fiat values. So bonds, stocks, real estate, cash, and there's underlying value to, the equities and the real estate, but they're still fiat denominated. So if you look at 900 trillion, you only need 10% of that is 90 trillion, and 2.5 times that is 300 trillion effect on Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And you're looking at something like, if half the world came into Bitcoin at 450 trillion, I think you're looking at like $65 million Bitcoin. And I think that's sort of a conservative number, because at that point, I mean, fiat is literally worthless, and anyone with a brain is getting out of that and into, and then you look at sort of on-chain metrics and you look at how little Bitcoin is actually for sale. So you think about, okay, at any of the peaks, there's no liquidity. You don't need all 21 million selling at $1 million of Bitcoin. You need one sat selling at $1 million of Bitcoin on one exchange for that to be the price, if that's the only sat in the game. And vice versa. On the low side, it's not that everyone is selling at once and it's low. It's there's a few people selling and there's a few buyers. So this thing's going to squeeze up and down violently. And it could even, I like this idea, it could even irrationally overshoot the world's value before it even settles at something. Yeah. And then it's always ever increasing from there, because more value is being created in the world, not just because as on the trajectory we're on now, but the trajectory goes up exponentially on Bitcoin versus fiat, because you have better allocation of investment and you have more interconnectivity between humans. We're all on the same network. And imagine, just from an accounting perspective, like, oh, I want to build a pencil. Oh, so let's buy some futures on some yuan. Let's buy some futures on yen. Let's buy, I mean, all the calculations we have to do just to buy, goods around the world, to do business with each other, to make each other happy. And we're all like, oh, I don't want to take your yuan and I need to buy options to defend myself against your rubles. I mean, this is crazy. And not just from a political standpoint, but from just a calculation standpoint. Like, how do you make a fucking calculation if you don't know what anything's going to be priced in the next 6 months in all these different currencies? And the amount of money and resources all these corporations are pouring into that game.
The FX market is so
it's
complex,
ridiculous,
isn't it? My brother-in-law, Chris, shout out to him wherever he is, works for a travel business. And one of his main jobs as a finance guy is hedging their risk between euros, Australian dollars, whatever else that they're, paying for holidays in and buying flights with, and hotels that they run. And it's crazy. And that's a full-time department doing that. And that's just one company. You think about, wow, like, why isn't there a global currency that everyone can use?
And none of these companies can afford any of this if they didn't have low interest rates.
That's true.
So you got all these zombie jobs. I mean, none of these are fulfilling. You might have a fulfilling life because it pays for something, but like, no one dreams about being a foreign currency arbitrager. How is that benefiting humanity? And you have all this talent going to all this financialization of the world instead of to anything that's really productive.
But to echo that, I'll have to ask Chris next time he comes for lunch.
Oh boy, don't say I said
that. I worked for a lot of the last 10 years as a shipbroker. So I was the middleman between ship owners and cargo holders. And, the whole point is find a price. You're trading a contract. It's a physical business, so you are actually moving things rather than derivatives, but it's still like, what are you actually doing? Like, it's an age-old job. It's an important thing as part of that industry, but like, what are you actually doing? Like,
that sounds like it has more merit though than some of the other stuff we talked about.
True.
But I hear you.
It does.
You're still a spreadsheet jockey. I get it.
But it's still just a freight rate, right? At the end of the day, it's how much does it cost from A to B, and it's changing all the time, and it could be done differently, and it's all done in US dollars, and there's cost of fuel and all this stuff. Anyway, I won't bore you with that. Cedric, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate you sharing your journey and explaining everything you have. Final is just a shout out. So where can people get in touch with you if they want to reach out?
Sure. They can find me at Ced Youngelman, CEDYOUNGELMAN on Twitter. They can find the Bitcoin Matrix podcast, which is a philosophical podcast about Bitcoin and the future of money. We look at the social implications, societal and cultural and economic implications of Bitcoin. You can find that on Twitter at _Bitcoin Matrix. And you can find it wherever you listen to podcasts and on YouTube. Check out the show, subscribe, and I hope you find it worth your time.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Jake. It's been awesome.
Okay, friends, nice work. You made it all the way to the end of the episode. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this conversation. As I said at the start, if you have any questions, then please don't hesitate to reach out. And if you enjoyed the episode, then please rate, like, subscribe, and share. That's it for now. Enjoy the rest of your day. All the best, Jake.